Okay, so let's pick up where we left off. Trans-Saharan caravan routes. This was, when we talk about the Trans-Saharan, we're talking about across the Saharan Desert in northern Africa. This is commerce across northern Africa. Along the Mediterranean coast were coastal cities and ports that were rich in vegetation and resources. We had commodities like dates, cotton, dyes, cloth, leather goods, and glass, and these were supplies from these cities and ports. So south of the rim of the Mediterranean Africa is the Sahara Desert, and merchants who ventured into it exchanged these items and carried out gold, salt, ivory, animal hides, slaves, and this connected to the Silk Road network. North Africa, around the turn of the calendar from BCE to CE, the camel was introduced as a means of transporting goods, and this led to a major increase in the amount of trade that occurred between West Africa and Southwest Asia. So what you need to know, like the importance of the camel, is that it led to a major increase. In the next era, around 600 to 1450, Islam was carried into the Trans-Sahara region along trade routes, just like Buddhism had spread into East Asia earlier. And we're going to talk about the spread of the major religions like Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity. But you do need to know that Islam was spread along these routes as well. And here's a map of the probable trade routes. These weren't as well documented as the Silk Roads were, but you do have some... we do have some idea. Obviously, you're not going to be able to go straight through the Sahara Desert that often, not without camels. So this route right here, these routes that don't, that are going straight through the Sahara Desert were later after the camel was introduced. The Indian Ocean Trading Network, or sea lanes, was the largest sea trading area in the world until the Europeans began crossing the Atlantic in the 1400s. The Indian Ocean connected Southeast Asia and China to Africa, to the Middle East, and to South Asia. It was a major conveyor of Buddhism from South Asia into East and Southeast Asia. And in the next era, Muslim merchants and missionaries carried their faith from the Middle East across the Indian Ocean into the same regions. Many of the same items that were carried along the Silk Roads and the other Eurasian land routes were also exchanged across the Indian Ocean. And it also connected lots of people, obviously. People interacted via the Indian Ocean trade routes, and so it facilitated the exchanges of cultural practices and religions. And here is the Indian Ocean. I hope you know where the Indian Ocean is. But this was the largest, again, sea lanes that we had in the world during this time period. And right here, these eras right here are talking about November to February monsoon winds right here, April to September monsoon winds going up, and we are going to talk more about monsoon winds in just a second. But this is a good map so you can kind of see how they blow. Beginning with the Egyptians and Phoenicians and continued by the Greeks, the Romans, and the Byzantines, the Mediterranean Sea network of trade was vast and it was long-lasting. Olives, pottery, glass, woodwork, leather, and wool textiles were exchanged across all parts of the Mediterranean world. Out of Africa, merchants traded gold, ivory, salt, copper, and slaves across and around the Mediterranean. And during the 1st century CE and continuing for many centuries, Christianity was carried into Eastern and Western Europe and Africa on foot by missionaries and merchants, but especially by boats that carried cargo and people across the Mediterranean. The Black Sea had Asia on its eastern shore and Europe on its western coastline. This was another important trading area before, during, and after the classical era. Constantinople, again, was one of the world's greatest points of exchange. And again, remember what I told you earlier, that Constantinople was also the key center of the north-south Eurasian trade routes, land routes. So Constantinople was in a great place for land routes as well as sea lane trading. They had a lot of merchants coming in and out of the city. And through the Black Sea, merchants carried goods from the Silk Roads, the Mediterranean, and Russia. But what's important to know about the Black Sea as well, this is one of these unintended consequences that we talked about, was the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, was actually carried into Western Europe in the next era, 600 to 1450. And of course, merchants didn't mean to do this, but they did, and it had drastic effects. So here's some maps showing you, this is the Mediterranean Sea. These are a lot of the trade routes in the Mediterranean Sea. And here's a lot of your trade routes in the Black Sea. You can see this area, this is tiny. I couldn't find a good map to show you the whole thing, but this area right here, this is the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, okay? Or the Adriatic Sea, I'm sorry. And this goes up, this is a part of the Adriatic Sea, and it's going to go up and connect to the Black Sea. So that's how it all connected. Let's talk a little bit about migrations of peoples and how the migrations of the peoples were a connection that was established during the classical era. The migration of the Bantu people began around 2000 BCE, and by 1000 CE, the Bantu occupied most of sub-Saharan Africa. Resources were stretched to their limits as the population increased, and as a result, groups of people began to leave the areas to set up new agricultural settlements, and the process repeated itself slowly. They often intermarried with those they came in contact with, and often those people adopted the Bantu language and joined Bantu society. So around 1000 BCE, the Bantus began to produce iron tools, which enabled them to clear more land and expand agriculture. This, of course, like we've talked about before, led to an increase in population and more migration. Around 500 CE, the cultivation of bananas actually enabled the Bantus to expand into heavily forested regions and continue the migration progress. And this Bantu migration actually facilitated the spread of agriculture throughout much of Africa, and there are over 500 distinct languages that can be traced back to the Bantus. Now let's talk about the Polynesians. Humans migrated to Australia around 60,000 years ago via watercraft that could travel with low sea levels. And people developed maritime technology and agricultural expertise. They eventually established settlements in the lands of the Pacific Ocean. Eventually, around 2000 BCE, they were traveling to islands like Vanuatu, Fiji, Samoa, and later even Hawaii. Long-distance voyages were taken on double canoes with large triangular sails. This carried a platform between the two hulls for a shelter. And we're going to talk more about maritime technology in just a second. Some scholars believe that these settlements were accidental. Some say they were planned. We don't really know. And as the migration spread, so did the cultivation of new food crops like yams, toros, breadfruit, and bananas, and the introduction of domesticated animals like dogs, pigs, and chickens. These developed into hierarchical chiefdoms in which leadership was passed down to the eldest son, and relatives served as the local aristocracy. There was conflict between the groups, population pressure, and this led to more migration, and the cultures and the languages of these widely dispersed islands often adapted and evolved differently. And we're going to stop right there for video 2.